A lonely mountain man discovered a blonde saloon girl tied to a wagon wheel, branded Lakota lover. The mountains had always been Eli Harper's home. He lived far from towns, far from the busy roads where wagons and carriages rumbled, and far from people who knew him only by the rumors that traveled faster than the wind. Eli was a tall man with broad shoulders and strong hands from years of hard work, trapping and hunting. His face was weathered, lined with the sun and wind, and his eyes, a sharp gray, could spot a deer at a distance where most people would see nothing. Life in the mountains was hard, but it was honest, and Eli preferred it that way. He did not need anyone else. The mountains, the rivers, and the wildlife were enough for him. Each day he would rise with the sun, sometimes earlier if the cold of winter forced him from his cabin. The small cabin he had built was modest, just a single room with a stone fireplace, a wooden table, and a bed he had stitched together himself. Outside, the forest stretched for miles, a sea of evergreens and hardwoods, with narrow paths that only someone like Eli could follow without getting lost. Sometimes he would trap rabbits, set snares for foxes, or fish in the nearby stream. Other days he would just walk, moving silently through the trees, listening to the sounds of the wind and the birds, watching the way the sun lit the mountain peaks. It was a quiet life, but it was one he had chosen and one he cherished. Despite his solitude, Eli was not unkind. He had met people in the past, traders, travelers, and hunters, but he preferred to keep his distance. People often spoke too much, asked too many questions, or judged him for living alone. They could not understand the peace he felt here. The mountains were honest. They did not lie, they did not betray, and they offered freedom. Each step he took on the forest floor, each time he drank from the stream, reminded him of a life that was simple, strong, and his own. One morning, the air was crisp with the bite of early autumn. The leaves had begun to turn shades of red, gold, and orange, and a thin mist hovered over the valleys. Eli had woken before dawn, as he usually did, and packed his small hunting bag. He was following a trail where he had seen fresh deer tracks the day before, curious to see where the animal had gone. His boots made little sound on the forest floor, and he moved with ease of someone who had spent decades among the trees. He breathed in the cold air and felt the calm of the mountains wrap around him like a warm blanket. As he followed the trail, Eli noticed something strange. It was not the tracks. Deer often left tracks, and foxes often left them too. It was something else, something human. A faint smell of smoke lingered in the air, though there was no campfire nearby, and the sense of another presence, however fleeting, made him pause. His instincts told him to be cautious. The mountains were safe, but not everyone who entered them had good intentions. Eli slowed, listening to the soft rustle of leaves, the distant call of a hawk, the whisper of the wind through the branches. The trail led him deeper into a narrow canyon, where sunlight barely touched the ground. The walls rose high on either side, and the forest grew dense. He moved quietly, scanning the area for any sign of danger, yet the strange feeling persisted. Then, in a small clearing ahead, something caught his eye. It was movement, small and subtle, but enough to make him stop. As he drew closer, the figure became clearer. A woman was tied to a wagon wheel, her clothes torn, her hair matted with dirt, and her face pale but defiant. Eli's heart raced. It was not common to find people in the mountains, and certainly not in this condition. He approached slowly, speaking softly so as not to startle her. "Are you hurt?" he asked. The woman lifted her eyes to meet his. They were blue and bright, filled with a mixture of fear, anger, and hope. Her lips moved, forming words that were barely audible. "Please, help me," she whispered. Eli knelt beside her and examined the ropes. They were rough and tight, cutting into her wrists and ankles. She was bruised and her clothes were stained with dirt and dried blood, though not enough to suggest a deep injury. Still, she needed help. Carefully he worked the ropes free, loosening the knots until she could pull her hands away. She moved slowly at first, rubbing her wrists and trying to regain feeling. As she stood, Eli noticed the brand on her back. It was crude, a set of letters burned into her skin. Lakota lover. He did not understand fully what it meant, but he could see the pain it must have caused. The woman, her name as she soon whispered, was Clara, explained that it was punishment, a cruel message for loving someone the townsfolk did not approve of. Her voice trembled as she spoke, not from fear but from anger and exhaustion. She had been left here, tied and exposed, as a warning to others, and somehow, by chance or fate, Eli had found her. He led her carefully to his cabin, offering her warmth by the fire and a place to rest. Clara was cautious, expecting betrayal, expecting more cruelty, but Eli did not judge her or question her choices. He understood, in his own quiet way, that people could be harsh, and sometimes those who were punished had done nothing wrong. She drank warm tea he made from herbs he had gathered, and slowly the tension in her body eased. The days that followed were gentle but full of quiet work. Eli helped Clara wash the dirt and blood from her skin, mended her torn clothes as best he could, and brought fresh food from the stream and the forest. Clara began to relax, sitting by the fire as Eli repaired tools or cleaned the cabin. She asked him questions about life in the mountains, about how he survived alone, about the animals and the trails. Eli answered simply, not as a teacher but as someone who had lived a long time in peace and solitude. At night they would sit together by the fire, the flames flickering on the walls of the cabin, and listen to the wind whisper through the trees. Clara began to tell her story in pieces, slowly, carefully, about the town she had come from, about the man she had loved, and about the terrible night when the townsfolk had left her branded and humiliated. Eli listened quietly, never interrupting, offering no advice or judgment, only presence and a steady calm that helped her feel safe. Over time, a bond began to grow. It was quiet at first, born of trust rather than affection, built from shared survival and the simple acts of kindness Eli offered. Clara learned that the mountains could be gentle, that a man like Eli could exist without cruelty or fear, and that even in the harshest landscapes there could be safety. Eli, in turn, found himself listening more closely, watching her face for the first signs of laughter or hope, feeling a warmth in his heart that solitude had never brought before. The mountains were still the same. They were wild, they were dangerous, and they were beautiful. But, for the first time, Eli did not feel entirely alone. The wind still whispered through the trees, and the stream still gurgled past the cabin, but now there was another presence, one that reminded him that life could be shared, even in the loneliest places. Clara's eyes, once full of fear and pain, now held a spark of curiosity and trust. And Eli, the lonely mountain man, began to understand that discovery was not just about trails and animals. It could also be about finding someone to care for, someone to share the quiet moments with, and someone whose story he could witness without judgment. Clara had never been so far from the town she knew. The mountains were enormous, stretching endlessly in every direction with jagged peaks that seemed to touch the sky and deep valleys where shadows moved like living things. Every sound, the rustle of leaves, the call of a distant hawk, the gurgle of the stream, felt sharper and more alive than anything she had experienced in the crowded streets of her hometown. The air was crisp, clean, and smelled of pine and earth, a sharp contrast to the smoke and dust she had grown used to in the saloons. She watched Eli move through the forest with a quiet confidence, each step careful and deliberate, as if the mountains themselves had taught him how to survive. At first, Clara was too frightened to speak much. She had been betrayed before, and, even after Eli untied her from the wagon wheel, she could not completely shake the fear that someone would return to finish what they had started. She shivered as she followed him toward the cabin, her hands still raw from the tight ropes. Eli noticed but said nothing, only keeping a steady pace and glancing back occasionally to ensure she was still with him. He understood that trust could not be forced, and that fear would not disappear overnight. When they reached the cabin, the warmth from the stone fireplace seemed almost magical. Clara hesitated at the threshold, staring at the small space that smelled of wood smoke and herbs. It was simple, humble, and clean, unlike the crowded and chaotic saloons she had known. The walls were bare, except for a few shelves filled with jars of dried herbs and small tools. A bed covered in blankets lay in the corner, and a small wooden table held a pot of tea and some bread. For the first time in days, Clara felt a flicker of safety. Ellie motioned for her to sit, and she hesitated, then slowly lowered herself onto the edge of the bed. Her hands trembled slightly as she unwrapped the blanket that covered it, careful not to touch anything too quickly. Eli began a small fire in the fireplace, using dry sticks and kindling, and soon the cabin was filled with a soft glow. He brewed tea with herbs he had gathered from the forest, the aroma warm and comforting. When he handed her the cup, Clara's hands were still shaking, but she took it anyway, her lips brushing against the warm liquid, savoring the taste. It was bitter, unlike the sweet drinks she had been used to, but there was a strength in it that seemed to match the mountains themselves. Over the next few days, Eli worked quietly around the cabin, chopping wood, repairing a torn blanket, and cleaning the small cabin space. Clara watched him, fascinated by how much he seemed to do alone and how effortlessly he managed to survive in such a harsh environment. Slowly she began to relax, helping him when she could, fetching water from the stream or gathering firewood. She was cautious, always aware that danger might lurk, but Eli's calm presence reassured her. He never asked questions she wasn't ready to answer, never pushed her to speak, and never made her feel judged. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the mountain peaks and the sky turned a soft orange, Clara finally spoke. "Why did you help me?" she asked quietly, her voice barely above the crackle of the fire. Eli looked up from stacking some firewood, his gray eyes steady. "Because no one deserves to be left like that," he said simply. Clara nodded, unsure if she believed it at first, but the sincerity in his voice made her heart feel lighter. As the days passed, Clara began to tell her story, piece by piece. She spoke of the saloon where she worked, of the men who came and went, and of the man she had loved, a gentle soul from a nearby Lakota tribe. Her love had been forbidden in the town, and when the townsfolk discovered it, they'd punished her cruelly. She had been branded, tied, and left as a warning, humiliated in a way she could not forget. Her voice broke as she recounted the events, but Eli remained silent, listening with a patience that felt almost unnatural. He did not interrupt, did not question, did not try to solve her problems. He simply listened. Clara began to notice the rhythm of mountain life. She watched Eli track deer, how he could move without leaving a trace, how he could read the forest and understand its secrets. She learned how to gather edible plants, how to build small traps, and how to light a fire even in damp conditions. Each day brought new lessons, and slowly her fear began to fade. The mountains, once intimidating and unknown, became a place of discovery, wonder, and even comfort. Eli also began to notice changes in himself. The solitude he had cherished for years now felt slightly empty without someone to share it with. He found himself thinking about Clara when he was out hunting or fishing, wondering if she had eaten enough, if she had warmed herself properly by the fire. The bond between them was quiet at first, almost invisible, but it grew stronger each day. In the silence of the mountains, their trust and understanding deepened, and for the first time in years, Eli felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. One afternoon, Clara and Eli walked together to a small waterfall not far from the cabin. The water cascaded over the rocks, sparkling in the sunlight, and the sound of it was soothing, almost hypnotic. Clara knelt by the edge and splashed water on her face, laughing softly as she did. Eli watched her, his expression unreadable, but a small smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. For a moment there were no brands, no townsfolk, no fear, just the mountains, the water, and the quiet companionship they had found in each other. But the peace was fragile. Even in these remote mountains, danger could not be entirely escaped. One morning, Eli noticed tracks near the cabin, boot prints that did not belong to him. He did not panic, but he grew alert. Clara noticed his change in demeanor and asked, "Are they coming?" Eli shook his head slightly, though his eyes were sharp. "Maybe," he said, "but we'll be ready if they do." He taught her how to move quietly through the forest, how to hide if necessary, and how to sense when someone approached. Clara learned quickly, and the fear that had once gripped her began to transform into a cautious courage. At night, as they sat by the fire, Clara spoke less about the past and more about the future, wondering what life might be like if she could stay here, away from the town and its cruelty. Eli listened, thinking carefully. The mountains offered freedom, but also isolation, and he wanted to be sure she understood both. Yet he did not discourage her. He only said, "The mountains do not care who you are. They only demand respect and patience. If you can live with that, you can live here." Clara nodded, feeling a strange sense of relief. For the first time she was not hiding, not running, not waiting for the next blow. She was safe, at least for now. Days turned into weeks, and Clara grew stronger. She could now move through the forest with Eli without stumbling, and she could light a fire or gather herbs on her own. She began to laugh more often, and her smiles became less rare. Eli noticed the change, a quiet approval in his heart. He had saved her life once, but now she was saving herself, slowly reclaiming her strength and spirit. One night, a storm swept through the mountains. Rain pelted the cabin, wind shook the trees, and lightning flashed across the sky. Clara huddled near the fire, frightened at first, but Eli's calm presence reassured her. Together, they reinforced the cabin, covered the small windows, and made sure the fire stayed alive. When the storm passed, they stepped outside and saw the mountains washed clean, the streams full and rushing, and the air fresh and pure. Clara breathed deeply, feeling alive in a way she had not since the night she was left tied to the wagon wheel. The mountains had tested her, and she had survived, stronger than she had imagined. By the time autumn deepened, Eli and Clara had settled into a routine. They hunted, gathered, cooked, and repaired the cabin together. Their days were full, yet quiet, and their nights were filled with stories, warmth, and a growing trust. The mountains were no longer just a place of solitude for Eli. They had become a place of companionship, learning, and healing for both of them. And though the brand on Clara's skin could never be erased, the mountains offered her something far more powerful: safety, freedom, and a chance to discover a new life. In those first weeks together, both Eli and Clara learned that Survival was not only about avoiding danger or finding food, it was about trust, patience, and understanding. The mountains could be cruel, unpredictable, and wild, but they could also teach resilience, courage, and hope. And in the quiet evenings, as the firelight danced across their faces, both of them realized that the bond forming between them was something neither had expected, yet something that would shape the days to come. The mountains had grown familiar to Clara, yet every day brought new discoveries and subtle reminders of their power. She had learned to move silently among the trees, to recognize the calls of birds, the rustle of small animals, and even the distant snapping of branches that might signal larger creatures nearby. Eli had become her guide and her teacher, showing her how to read the forest, how to find safe spots for water and food, and how to respect the wild without fear. But this was more than survival. Over time, Clara began to feel a quiet sense of freedom she had never known in the crowded, judgmental streets of her town. Eli himself noticed the change in her. When they hunted, she moved with a growing confidence, her steps lighter, her eyes sharper. She could track deer, spot hidden berries, and even navigate the narrow paths of the forest without his guidance. Yet her laughter, soft and cautious at first, was becoming more common, breaking the long silence that had settled between them in those first days. For Eli, who had spent years alone, it was a strange and welcome sound. It reminded him that life could still surprise him, and that perhaps even a man who had chosen solitude could find companionship without losing himself. One morning the two of them ventured farther into the mountains than they ever had before. Eli had heard from the distant streams and old trails that there was a small clearing beyond the ridge, filled with wildflowers and overlooked by a rock outcropping that gave a view of the entire valley below. Clara walked beside him, keeping pace with his long strides. She had grown stronger in the mountains, her muscles lean from climbing hills and carrying wood, and her face no longer showed the fear and exhaustion from the day he had found her. When they reached the clearing, Clara gasped. The sight was breathtaking. A carpet of golden and purple flowers stretched as far as the eye could see, swaying gently in the morning breeze. Birds darted across the sky in flashes of color, and the valley below shimmered with the reflection of the river winding through it. For the first time, Clara felt a sense of awe so deep it took her breath away. She turned to Eli, who was standing quietly beside her, his expression calm but attentive. "It's beautiful," she whispered. Eli nodded, a rare softness in his gray eyes. "The mountains have their rewards," he said simply. "If you know where to look and how to respect them, they give you beauty and peace." The peace, however, was fragile. Life in the mountains was never without risk, and Eli knew it well. As they explored the clearing, he noticed something unusual near the far edge, a set of tracks that did not belong to deer, elk, or any animal he recognized. They were human footprints, fresh and deliberate. He studied them closely, noticing the way the prints pressed deep into the soil, indicating someone of strength and purpose had walked through here recently. Eli's expression darkened, Clara noticed, but before she could ask, he spoke. "We may not be alone," he said quietly. "Someone has been here." Clara's heart raced, but Eli's calmness was grounding. He taught her how to follow the tracks without being noticed, how to read the signs that someone had passed through, and how to judge whether the person posed a threat. They moved carefully, observing from the shadows of the trees, and soon Eli concluded that it was likely travelers or hunters from the town, people who had not given up on finding the girl they had punished. Clara's pulse quickened. She remembered the night tied to the wagon wheel, the humiliation, and the fear. But now, standing beside Eli in the mountains, she felt a new sense of strength and hope. Over the next few days, Eli and Clara prepared for the possibility of visitors. He showed her how to reinforce the cabin with branches and stones, how to conceal their movements in the forest, and how to use the terrain to their advantage. Clara learned quickly, absorbing every lesson, asking questions, and practicing silently as Eli demonstrated. She began to trust her instincts, realizing that the mountains had taught her something she had never known: courage. Not the reckless kind, but the quiet, patient courage that came from understanding the land and trusting in one's own abilities. One afternoon, as they checked a small trap Eli had set near the stream, Clara nearly fell, slipping on the wet rocks. Eli's hand shot out instantly, steadying her before she could hurt herself. For a moment they stood close, the sound of the rushing water between them, and their eyes met. Clara felt warmth spread through her chest, an unfamiliar but welcome feeling. She realized that she no longer felt like a helpless victim, tied and branded by the cruelty of others. She had become a partner in survival, a companion to a man who had once been a stranger, and someone who could face the dangers of the mountains with skill and confidence. Evenings were the quietest time of all. After the work of the day was done, collecting firewood, repairing tools, preparing food, They would sit by the fireplace, listening to the wind, through the trees and the distant calls of animals. Clara shared small stories of her past, careful not to dwell too long on pain, while Eli shared tales of the mountains, of past hunts, and lessons he had learned in solitude. They began to find joy in simple routines, the crackle of the fire, the taste of warm bread, the beauty of sunlight on the peaks. In those moments, the world outside, the town, the branding, the cruelty felt distant, almost unreal. One day, as they explored a narrow canyon, they spotted movement across the ridge. A small group of men, likely from the town, were following an old trail, their intentions unclear but certainly unwelcome. Eli motioned for Clara to stay low, and they watched from the cover of trees. He whispered instructions on how to move silently, how to avoid leaving tracks, and how to use the rocks and terrain for protection. Clara's hands were steady, her breathing controlled, as she followed each instruction. It was a test, one that would measure how far she had come since the day she had been found tied to the wagon wheel. They waited until the men had passed before continuing, careful to stay hidden until the coast was clear. Clara felt a mix of fear and exhilaration. She realized that she no longer needed to rely entirely on Eli. She could now read the forest, anticipate danger, and respond with caution and intelligence. The bond between them grew stronger in these moments, not because of shared words, but because of shared experiences, trust, and reliance on one another. Over time, Clara began to see the mountains not just as a place of survival, but as a home. She helped Eli improve the cabin, storing food for the winter, repairing the roof, and learning how to smoke fish and meat for long-term preservation. They moved together through the forest, hunting, gathering, and exploring, learning the rhythm of the land and each other. Each day, she became more confident in her movements, her decisions, and her understanding of the world beyond the town she had left behind. One evening, as the sun set behind the peaks, they sat together on a rocky ledge overlooking the valley. The sky was painted with shades of pink and gold, and the river below sparkled like a ribbon of silver. Clara leaned against Eli, feeling the warmth of his presence, and whispered, "I never thought I could feel safe again." Eli did not speak at first, only watched the horizon. Then he said, softly but firmly, "You're safe here, and you will be as long as you choose to stay." For the first time, Clara felt that safety was possible, not just a fleeting hope, but a reality she could touch and rely on. The mountains had tested her, taught her, and transformed her, and Eli had been both guide and protector through it all. She realized that she had not only survived, but had begun to live in a way she had never known before, free from fear, stronger than before, and with a quiet courage that came from facing danger and choosing to persevere. As autumn deepened into winter, their days grew shorter and the cold more biting. Snow began to dust the peaks and drift into the valleys, and the forest became quieter, covered in white. Yet Clara and Eli continued their routines, adapting to the new challenges. They built fire pits, stocked wood, and learned to find and store food that could last through the cold months. Each challenge, each obstacle, only strengthened their partnership, and Clara felt a deep gratitude for the man who had found her, cared for her, and helped her discover a new strength within herself. By the time the first heavy snow fell, Clara was no longer the frightened, helpless girl tied to a wagon wheel. She had become a capable, confident woman, skilled in survival, knowledgeable of the mountains, and deeply connected to the man who had saved her. Eli, once entirely alone, had found companionship, trust, and perhaps even the beginnings of something deeper. The mountains, with all their danger and beauty, had brought them together, and both of them had changed forever. Winter had settled fully in the mountains. The peaks were dusted with snow, the rivers had frozen edges, and the trees were heavy with frost. The cold was sharper than anything Clara had ever known, and the nights seemed endless, with only the small cabin and its fire keeping the darkness at bay. Despite the chill, she moved with a confidence that surprised her, walking beside Eli through snow-laden paths, learning to step carefully to avoid sinking too deep or leaving tracks that others could follow. The mountains had become a home, but she knew deep down that danger could appear at any moment. Eli was alert as always, his sharp eyes scanning the horizon, his ears tuned to every sound. He had taught Clara to listen to the wind in the trees, to sense changes in the snow, and to recognize footprints that did not belong to deer or elk. One afternoon, as they moved along a ridge to check the traps they had set for rabbits, Eli paused, his hand raised in a silent signal for Clara to stop. She crouched beside him, following his gaze. Far below, in the shadowed valley, a small group of figures moved cautiously through the snow. They were human, carrying packs, and though their pace was slow, their purpose was clear. They were searching. Clara felt her heart pound in her chest, fear rising for a moment, but Eli's calm presence steadied her. "They're from the town," he said quietly, his voice low but firm. "We need to be careful. They're likely looking for you." Clara swallowed hard, remembering the night she had been left tied to the wagon wheel, humiliated and abandoned. But now, with Eli beside her, she felt a new strength. She had learned to survive, to move silently, and to think ahead. Eli led her to a narrow ledge above the valley, hidden behind thick pine branches. From there they could watch the group without being seen. He explained that they would need to remain patient, to avoid making noise, and to wait until the men passed. Clara nodded, her hands steady, though her heart still raced. She realized that the mountains had taught her more than just survival. They had taught her courage, the kind that came not from recklessness, but from knowing when to act and when to wait. The men below moved slowly, searching the valley floor and the trails. Eli whispered instructions to Clara, showing her how to watch for their shadows, how to listen for their voices, and how to anticipate where they might go next. She learned quickly, understanding that her safety depended on both observation and patience. Hours passed, and the men eventually moved on, leaving the valley empty and quiet once more. Clara exhaled slowly, relief flooding through her. She looked at Eli, her eyes full of gratitude and admiration. "I couldn't have done that without you," she said softly. Eli nodded, a rare smile touching his lips. "You did more than you think," he replied. "You've learned well." That night they sat by the fire, the warmth cutting through the cold that pressed against the cabin walls. Clara felt a new sense of trust in Eli, and in herself. She realized that the mountains, which had seemed so dangerous and unfamiliar at first, were now a place where she could grow stronger, not just physically, but emotionally. The cabin had become a sanctuary, a place where fear could be faced and courage could be discovered. As the days passed, Eli and Clara continued to prepare for the possibility of more visitors. They reinforced the cabin with extra logs, built hidden caches for food and supplies, and created small trails that could lead them safely away if needed. Clara practiced moving silently through the snow, learning to leave no trace behind, and to use the natural cover of the trees and rocks to hide from anyone who might follow. She was no longer a frightened girl from the town. She was a capable partner, learning to navigate a world that had once seemed impossible. One morning as they scouted a nearby ridge, Clara spotted something unusual, footprints in the fresh snow. They were larger than hers, deeper than Eli's, and they moved in a pattern that suggested more than casual travel. Eli examined them carefully, his expression serious. "They're back," he said quietly. "They must have followed the valley and are now tracking us." Clara felt a shiver run through her, but she did not panic. She knew what to do. She followed Eli's instructions, moving with him silently along a hidden path that would keep them above the valley while remaining unseen. For the next several days, the group of men searched the area relentlessly. Clara and Eli moved cautiously, using every skill they had learned. They avoided open spaces, hid behind trees and rocks, and never allowed themselves to be seen. Despite the constant tension, Clara found that her fear no longer controlled her. She had learned to trust her instincts, to anticipate danger, and to rely on Eli's guidance without losing her own judgment. She was becoming a mountain woman, strong, alert, and capable. During one particularly cold evening, as snow fell softly outside the cabin, Eli and Clara shared a quiet conversation by the fire. Clara looked at the man who had saved her, who had guided her, and who had become her companion. "I never thought I could feel safe again," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Eli looked at her, his gray eyes steady and kind. "You are safe," he said simply. "And you will be, as long as you trust yourself and the mountains." Clara felt a warmth spread through her chest, a mix of gratitude, trust, and something she could not yet name. The snow continued to fall, covering the forest in a thick blanket of white. Clara and Eli worked together to ensure the cabin was secure, stocking wood and food and checking traps. They moved as a team, their actions synchronized, each understanding the other without words. The mountains had tested them both, but they were learning not just to survive, but to thrive. Their bond was deepening, built on trust, shared experience, and the quiet understanding that danger could be faced together. One afternoon, Eli suggested they explore a frozen creek that ran not far from the cabin. The ice had formed solid sheets over the water, creating a landscape both beautiful and treacherous. Clara followed carefully, her eyes scanning the surface for cracks, her steps measured and precise. She felt alive in a way she had not before. The thrill of movement, the cold biting her cheeks, and the sense of freedom in the mountains filling her with energy. Eli watched her with pride, noting her skill and courage. She was no longer the frightened girl he had found tied to a wagon wheel. She was strong, capable, and alive. As they reached the middle of the creek, a sudden sound made them both freeze. The snap of a branch echoed in the silence of the snow-covered forest. Eli signaled for Clara to move behind a large rock. They crouched low, watching carefully. A lone figure appeared at the edge of the trees, a man from the town, searching for the girl they had punished. Eli and Clara remained perfectly still, the cold biting at their fingers and cheeks, hearts racing but silent. The man moved slowly, unaware of their presence, and eventually passed without noticing them. Clara exhaled slowly, the tension leaving her body. She realized that she had learned more than survival. She had learned patience, observation, and the quiet strength that comes from facing danger without panic. The days that followed were filled with similar challenges. Small signs of people searching the forest reminded them that the town's reach could still extend into their mountains. Yet Clara and Eli continued their routines, growing stronger and more confident with each passing day. They hunted together, gathered food, and repaired the cabin. They learned the rhythms of the snow, the frozen streams, and the hidden dangers that lay beneath. And as they worked side by side, the bond between them grew deeper. One evening, after a long day of checking traps and collecting firewood, they sat together by the fire. Clara leaned against Eli, feeling the warmth of his presence and the security of their shared space. She thought of the night she had been tied to the wagon wheel, of the fear, humiliation, and pain. And she realized how far she had come. She was no longer powerless. She was strong, capable, and safe, and she had Eli by her side as both protector and companion. The mountains had become more than a place of survival. They were a place of growth, trust, and connection. Clara and Eli had faced danger, weather, and uncertainty together, and each challenge had brought them closer. The cabin, once a simple shelter, was now a home filled with warmth, laughter, and quiet understanding, and though the threat from the town still lingered in the distance, they knew that together they could face whatever came next. As winter pressed on, the bond between Clara and Eli became undeniable. It was not a bond built on words alone, but on shared experiences, mutual respect, and the trust that comes from facing fear side by side. In the mountains, they had discovered not just survival, but companionship, courage, and the quiet power of being there for each other when the world seemed determined to bring them down. And as the first heavy snowstorms of the season coated the forest in white, Clara and Eli prepared for the months ahead. They knew that life in the mountains would always be challenging, that danger could appear without warning, and that their skills and trust in each other would be tested again. But they also knew that they had found something rare and precious, the ability to face the wild together, to protect each other, and to discover a bond that neither distance, danger, nor cruelty could break. Winter in the mountains had reached its deepest, coldest stage. Snow covered every ridge, every tree, and even the small cabin where Eli and Clara had made their home. The forest was quiet, except for the soft hiss of wind through the pines and the occasional sound of snow falling from a branch. Life was harsh, but it had also taught them patience, skill, and resilience. For Clara, the months in the mountains had changed her completely. She was no longer the frightened girl tied to a wagon wheel, nor was she the vulnerable saloon girl from the town. She had become strong, capable, and independent. Yet she also recognized a bond she had never expected to form with the solitary mountain man who had saved her. Eli had always lived alone, trusting only the mountains to provide for him, but over time he had come to rely on Clara in small, meaningful ways. He noticed how she could track animals, gather firewood, and even predict the weather by observing the clouds and snow patterns. He observed her growing confidence, the way her hands were no longer trembling, and how her eyes sparkled with curiosity instead of fear. Each day he realized that the mountains, which had once been a refuge for his solitude, were now a place where companionship and trust could grow. Despite their isolation, life was not without challenges. Food had to be secured for the winter months, the cabin maintained against storms, and the frozen streams navigated carefully. One day, while checking traps along a distant ridge, they encountered a herd of deer, a sight both beautiful and vital. Eli whispered instructions, and Clara moved with precision, following his guidance to set up a small trap. Their teamwork was seamless, built on trust and understanding developed over months of shared effort. The deer were successfully caught, providing meat that would last for days, and both felt a quiet satisfaction in their accomplishment. But life in the mountains was not just about survival. It was about connection, trust, and learning to appreciate beauty in the harshest conditions. Clara often marveled at the simplicity and honesty of mountain life. Each sunrise brought a new palette of colors across the snow-covered peaks, and each sunset cast long shadows through the forest, painting the world in gold and crimson. He learned to recognize the tracks of different animals, the subtle changes in the wind, and the patterns of the clouds that could signal storms. Every day brought knowledge, experience, and the joy of being alive in a world that demanded awareness and respect. As the winter wore on, Clara and Eli's bond deepened in ways beyond survival. They shared quiet meals by the fire, laughed softly at small mistakes, and exchanged stories of lives they had lived before the mountains. Clara spoke of the town she had left behind, the cruelty she had endured, and the brief moments of kindness she had known. Eli shared tales of the mountains, of past hunts, and of lessons learned in solitude. Each story brought them closer, revealing layers of personality, strength, and vulnerability that neither had shown to anyone else. One particularly cold evening, a storm raged outside, snow swirling and wind howling through the trees. The cabin creaked under the weight of the snow, and the fire inside offered their only warmth. Clara watched Eli carefully tend the flames, admiring the quiet determination with which he managed their survival. The storm reminded them both that the mountains were never truly safe, but it also reinforced the strength they had gained together. For Clara, the storm was no longer a source of terror. It was a challenge they could face together and a reminder of how far they had come. By the end of winter, the threat from the town had faded. The men who had once searched for Clara had given up, unwilling to brave the harsh terrain of the mountains. Eli and Clara could finally move through the forest without constant worry, and the days grew brighter with the promise of spring. Yet even with the danger gone, they knew they could not return to the town. Clara had tasted freedom and independence in the mountains, and the town, with its judgment and cruelty, held no appeal. She had discovered a life in which she could be herself, strong, respected, and safe. The snow melted into streams that rushed through the valleys, filling the rivers and nourishing the forest. Flowers began to bloom along the ridges, and the air was filled with the scent of fresh growth. Eli and Clara ventured further into the mountains, exploring new trails, discovering hidden groves, and setting up small gardens to supplement their food. They learned to anticipate the patterns of the seasons, to prepare for the heat of summer, and to ensure that their cabin remained a safe and comfortable refuge. Life, once dictated by fear and survival, now included creativity, curiosity, and joy. In these months, Clara discovered not only her strength but also her sense of belonging. She had found a home in the mountains, a place where her past could not define her, and where she could live according to her own choices. Eli, who had once believed that solitude was the only way to live, discovered the joy of sharing life with someone he trusted completely. Together, they built routines, celebrated small victories, and developed a rhythm to life that was both peaceful and fulfilling. Their days were filled with practical tasks, but also with moments of quiet intimacy. They would sit by the stream, watching the sunlight reflect on the water, or climb to a high ridge to survey the valley below. They shared meals of fresh-caught fish, roasted vegetables, and bread they had baked themselves. They laughed, shared stories, and slowly the walls of loneliness and fear that had once separated them from the world and each other began to dissolve. In the mountains they found not only survival but a deep companionship, a trust, and even the beginnings of love that neither had expected. By summer, their life in the mountains was fully established. The cabin was secure, their food stores plentiful, and their knowledge of the land complete enough that they could travel long distances without worry. Clara had grown strong and independent, capable of moving through the forest with the confidence of someone who knew the mountains as well as the townspeople knew the streets. Eli, meanwhile, had learned the subtle joys of companionship, realizing that even a mountain man could find connection, warmth, and trust with another human being. One late afternoon, as they sat on a rocky outcrop watching the sun dip behind the peaks, Clara turned to Eli. "I never imagined life could be like this," she said, her voice soft but full of wonder. "I thought I would always be running, always afraid. But here I feel alive." Eli looked at her, the wind ruffling his hair, his expression calm and steady. "The mountains can be harsh," he said, "but they can also teach you to live. And sometimes they bring the right people together in the right place." Clara smiled, feeling the truth in his words. For the first time in her life, she felt fully free, fully seen, and fully safe. As the seasons continued, Eli and Clara built a life that was no longer defined by fear or past mistakes. They planted small gardens, hunted and fished with skill, and explored hidden valleys and ridges. They celebrated milestones together, from the first bloom of spring flowers to the first catch of the season. Each day brought work, but also the quiet satisfaction of living in harmony with the land and with each other. The mountains, once a place of isolation and survival, had become a home filled with trust, companionship, and joy. Clara often thought about her past, about the night she had been tied to the wagon wheel and branded, about the cruelty of the townsfolk and the fear that had once consumed her. But those memories no longer held power over her. They were part of her story, yes, but they did not define her. She had survived, adapted, and grown stronger than she had ever imagined. With Eli by her side, she had found not only safety, but also a sense of belonging, love, and purpose. Eli, too, reflected on how much had changed. He had come to the mountains to escape the world, to live in solitude and freedom. Yet in Clara he had found a companion who challenged him, inspired him, and brought warmth to a life that had once been only cold and quiet. The mountains were still wild, unpredictable, and beautiful, but now they were shared. They had faced challenges together, survived threats, and learned to trust each other in ways that went beyond words. By the end of the year, Eli and Clara had established a life that was peaceful, secure, and full of quiet joy. The mountains had tested them, but they had also rewarded them. They had learned the true meaning of trust, courage, and companionship. Clara had discovered that freedom was not just about escaping danger. It was about learning to trust herself, to live fully, and to share life with someone who respected and valued her. Eli had learned that solitude could be enriched by trust and love, and that companionship did not weaken the spirit, but strengthened it. As they stood together on a high ridge overlooking the valley blanketed in snow, they felt a sense of accomplishment, peace, and hope. They had survived, they had grown, and they had discovered a life that was theirs to shape. The mountains had given them freedom, safety, and a bond that could not be broken by distance, fear, or cruelty. And as the sun set, casting a warm golden glow across the peaks, Clara and Eli knew that they had found something rare and lasting, a home, each other, and the quiet joy of living fully in the wild.